Yeah, why isn't it?
Because
You're
you
missing
haven't
out.
you haven't clicked on that little video thing that looks like a camera down in the corner.
Okay.
It has a little red line across it. It looks like mine.
Hmm. Well,
Oh well.
It's not working.
sorry, I don't have
Generally
a
on the
PC.
bottom, on the left, maybe that's the second one over from.
Do you have your iPad, Helena, or your phone?
I have my iPad.
It should, well, on
Oh,
my iPad, it's at the bottom of your screen, and you do have to hit the bottom of your screen to have those icons show up.
I'll try.
okay. It's worked before.
Yeah.
It did. So why
Hmm.
doesn't it work now? Okay, wait, maybe that'll.
Oh, there
Yeah,
you
There
go.
you are.
there I am.
Woohoo. Okay. Any questions from last week to get us started? This place I always seem to start. Okay. All right. Well, what the take there's a the takeaway from last week that I want to start with this week is Jason Moore's critique of the word Anthropocene. So he thinks we should use the word capitalocene because it's not people writ large who are responsible, it's capitalism in particular that's responsible. And it occurred to me this is a kind of he's making a point that people academics have been noticing for many decades is that in political discourse and in fact just in ordinary language, um, this word we does a lot of work. So Anthropocene, we humans are responsible. And then you ask, poor people in the middle of Africa how responsible they are, and it turns out not much, not at all. So that we is a little misplaced depending on where in the world you want to take it. And I came across an interesting video. It's actually a climate scientist who's doing a TED talk, kind of doing an update on where is the science today. And I noticed that he uses the word we or our or humanity in like four or five different senses. And so I thought it would just be an interesting little exercise to show you the video and just pause to reflect on who's the we when he says we. So the other day, I was trying to figure out the order of things I wanted to do for class, and so I thought, oh, let me watch this again and just see what I'm getting you all into, and I just watched it straight through and just counted how many times that came up. It's a 17-minute video. 100 times he used
Wow.
the word we or our or humanity.
Wow.
Like, okay, clearly cannot stop every time through the whole video. It'll take all day. 100 times. It just blew my mind counting them out. It was like, wow. But anyway, I think so. I thought I'd still try and do it, but just for a little while, and just so you show you part of it, and just sort of as an little exercise in this thinking about how we use language,
Mhm.
because I think the point that what more is getting at, the real underlying point, is not just sort of this sort of technical point of not everyone's responsible. It really is about how we use language and how we talk about politics, and especially if we're going to. I mean, the idea is really to assign blame in a more concrete way that motivates people to behave differently, whereas the we language has a way of blame, imposing the blame on everyone, and so individuals feel like somehow they should be doing things different. But individually, it's insignificant what we do individually. What really matters is big decisions made by governments and big corporations. So the idea, I think, is if you can get people to pay attention to the fact that blame for this problem it can be fixed and identified on particular sorts of actors, then people don't have to feel bad that somehow they're responsible because they didn't adopt, an all green lifestyle early enough. It's actually somebody else's responsibility, somebody else's fault, and you can get mad at them about that and demand that they make real change. So it's an important political point, even though it seems a little academic on the surface.
I think
Hmm?
that too, Richard, when, people say we have to help the disadvantaged. Well, that is so generic, but when you say children are not getting breakfast in the morning or not getting fed, it becomes a little more real.
Hmm? Yeah. So language can hide or disclose. It's yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, let's see what this looks like. Here he is. So yeah, so okay. Let's see. Forget that for a second.
Scientists and climate scientists are getting seriously nervous. The planet is changing faster than we had.
Planet's changing faster than we had expected. Who's the we? Scientists.
Oh, okay.
Expected. We are, despite years of
This one.
raising the alarm, now seeing that the
So we, in spite of years of raising, so we scientists raising the alarm.
planet is actually in a situation where we underestimated risks.
So that we again is scientists. We scientists underestimated the risk.
Abrupt changes are occurring in a way that is way beyond the realistic expectations in science. 15 years back, I introduced the planetary boundary framework, the scientific framework with the 9 Earth system processes that determines the stability, the resilience, and the life support on planet Earth. 10 years back, the world signed the Paris Climate Agreement. Almost 5 years.
No, that's actually, so the world there is also one of those kind of sneaky little points. So who signed the agreement? Well, a lot of heads of governments signed it. So now, and of course, the US did, but then withdrew with Trump and I think got back in, and I think we're back out again with Trump again. So that we then is politicians signed this agreement.
Years back, we entered the decisive decade.
We entered the decisive decade. Now that one might actually be a real we writ large humanity entered a decisive decade.
Where our choices will
Our choices. Okay, see now that's I think where it gets slippery, right? So the first we seems like a proper use of a universal we, that we humanity entered this. Now, our choices. Whose choices?
will determine the future for all generations
Okay, that all seems like a
planet
fairly
Earth.
universal.
Where are we on this journey? Halfway.
Where are we on this journey? Okay, though that also sounds like that might be good use of we as humanity on this journey, but it's not. A lot of us are just riding along while more powerful people are making decisions, is the point.
Into this decade. I will give you a scientific state of the planet report, the most objective assessment that science can give today. And it starts here. We've reached 1.2 degrees Celsius of.
We've reached. Who's we?
So that sounds like the planet.
Yeah. But the we implies responsibility, right? So
Global mean surface temperature rise, the warmest temperature on Earth over the past 100,000 years. We have just scratched.
we have just scratched. So that would same one there. The planet has just scratched, but the we implies the responsibility.
On 1.5 degrees Celsius as an annual mean in 2023. But what worries us most is that.
Okay, worries us. Scientists again?
We are starting to see.
Okay, now that one could be everyone because he's pointing it out to the whole world, but certainly it's science right, oriented towards the scientists who are seeing this data.
An acceleration of warming over the past 50 years, 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade from 1970 to 2010. But then from 2014 onwards, it abruptly jumps up to 0.26 per decade. And if we follow this path, we will crash.
We will crash through. Planet will.
through 2 degrees Celsius within 20 years and hit 3 degrees Celsius by the year 2100, a disastrous outcome caused by us humans.
Caused by us humans. So, I mean, it's true that it was caused by humans. It's just the us part seems a little suspicious. Some humans.
But it's not only carbon dioxide. Any parameter that matters for human well-being and our economies look the same.
Okay, our economies, that sounds like he's referencing, that's a proper reference for all people.
Same. Here you have it, linear change up until the 1950s. We go into the great acceleration, and this is what we're seeing across.
What we're seeing, scientists again.
Overconsumption of fresh water, the 6th max extinction of species, over eutrophying our freshwater systems with
our freshwater systems. Okay, that sounds like the planet again.
nitrogen and phosphorus, all of it undermining the stability of the planet. As if this was not enough, we are seeing that.
Okay, we are seeing, that's probably scientists again.
This is now causing impacts across the entire economy. We're seeing
that might be economists then. Economy.
Bigger and bigger invoices being sent by the Earth system onto societies across the entire world in droughts, floods, heat waves, disease patterns, human reinforced storms, scientifically attributed to human-caused climate change.
Human-caused climate change. Okay, so I think you get the point. It's kind of curious that if you wanted to try and rewrite the text that he's using, sort of the notes that he was using to give this talk, you could do it in a way that captured all of those different nuances by using slightly different words. Scientists have found, the planet is, everyone's economies are. So you could do it in a way that called attention to, which specific group is being referred to in the plural pronoun there. But we humans, it seems to me, writ large, are actually linguistically fluid enough that would feel kind of awkward. And so that's why he doesn't do it. But it might have some important political consequences if in general people did use language like that more precisely, which I think that's Moore's point, getting people to use the language more precisely. Okay, what do you think?
I agree. But we're so used to bumper sticker statements.
Well, yeah, that too.
There's what I used when I taught science, I used to call garbage words. And like germ is one of them, and lesion is another one. And so this is turning into, for me now, and as I'm thinking about this, these are garbage words.
Yeah, they're missing the precision they should have.
Exactly. And they kind of gloss over stuff. So people think they know what they've heard.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
That they just, the word itself is a comfort. Yeah, watch out for germs. Oh, okay. What are you talking about?
Okay, yeah. All right, let's see. I think what I wanted to do next. So, on a kind of deeper philosophical level, the guy who's responsible for getting this conversation going, that Koichi Saito's book is a big part of this conversation, but the guy who's really kind of credited with getting this conversation going is a guy named John Bellamy Foster, who teaches sociology, I believe. Yeah, I think it's sociology at the University of Oregon, where my daughter goes to school. But he's studying science stuff, so she hasn't had a class with him, unfortunately. I tried to encourage that, but it didn't work out. Anyway, so Foster 20 years ago, a little actually more than 20 years ago, has started writing more about the issue of how Marxists should and could think about the environment and environmental issues. And I have a little video with him too that we're going to get to towards the end of class to have him introduce himself to you. But one of the things I noticed about what he's up to is that I think Foster's is trying to reach back to the deeper, more systematic philosophy that is Marxism. So if you recall, let me, if I'm going to do this introduction, I should do it big screen. Okay, so Marxism really means two different things. So there is a narrow sense in which Marxism means historical materialism, Marx's materialist theory of history. And so that Marxism is the political Marxism, the Marx that talks about class struggle, talks about revolutions, is interested in how capitalism specifically develops and how it might come to an end. So that all of that philosophy of history. Now, it's called historical materialism because Marx is reacting to Hegel's philosophy of history, which was very idealist in its orientation. Hegel's mostly relying on what's called a great man theory of history, that history is moved by powerful individuals who are sort of forming the world around them, like the Caesars in Rome, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, that those people, they make history what it is. And so it's very, in that sense, it's idealist because it's history guided by the idea of certain people in Hegel's view. So Marx is coming along and saying, okay, that way of looking at history is not going to do. It's clearly flawed. There's something more basic going on, and that's where they get the line about from the Communist Manifesto about the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle. So what Marx is arguing is that our history is rooted in the materiality of our experiences and how those change over time. And so we were responding to the material conditions of our lives. It's not big ideas that drive history, but it's people's experiences of how their life is actually going. Which is why class struggle would guide it, is because when things aren't going well, people are going to push politically and make changes. Okay, so that's the narrow kind of sense of what Marxism is. There's a bigger, broader sense of Marxism that's a philosophical system, and that's what's called dialectical materialism. And so that dialectical materialism is a marriage of Hegel's ideas about the patterns of how things change, dialectics, married with a materialist theory of reality. That what is real is just matter in motion. It actually is language that Lenin used to like to use, matter in motion, to try to simplify the idea. It's just that the motion has these curious patterns that Hegel was calling dialectic. And there's those three laws of dialectics, but we'll catch up with those in a minute. So the movement has three kind of major patterns to it. So as a systematic philosophy, then, dialectical materialism is a complete understanding of the whole universe. And so in that way, what's being argued is that the patterns that we see, which start out as patterns kind of in logic that Hegel's using to analyze what he's noticing in history. And Hegel introduces this logic, which is how the dialectic is of the logic of these dialectical movements. Oh, nuts! I just forgot where I was going with that thought.
Well, the two distinctions of materialism, historical and dialectic,
No, yeah, it's the systematic thing I'm on now. Okay, yeah. So, but the point is, it as a system, then it wants to include kind of everything we know about the world in one scheme. So if there's if the materialist, well, the materialist position is there is one reality. Human beings and our ideas about the world are just part of that one reality. So the patterns that we find in that one reality should be patterns that hold across different ways of looking at different kinds of topics that you would look at the world. So the metaphysics, which is where everything starts in philosophy, what is ultimately real? That's material. The epistemology, how do you know what's real? Well, you know it from your experience. You don't know it from your dreams. You don't know it from your imagination. You don't know it even from your intuition. You know it from your experience. And so everything about the world is relating to this materiality and how it moves. And that everything includes human beings as one product that nature has produced, which means if you take it then sort of into all its deeper implications, that means that human history is really a part of natural science. It's just this curious kind of subdiscipline that's focused on the particular actions of one species.
Oh,
We call
that's
that history.
interesting.
But it's still part of nature because we are part of nature. And so the philosophy and the rules, the patterns that you're thinking of, the dialectics of that motion that we see in history, we should also see in nature. And in fact, should see everywhere. We see it. And so the idea becomes it's in nature, it's in society, and it's in our thinking. Because we think by noticing these patterns. So actually, Nature, Society, and Thought is the name of a really prominent Marxist journal that's picking up on exactly that idea. So Foster, it seems to me, is interested in recapturing the significance of Marxism as a systematic philosophy. And so it's because he's seeing the whole of reality as part of one system, and you can understand it in one systematic way. That's part of the argument that of course Marxism is open to and wants to engage with environmental issues because those are vital issues to human history.
Mhm.
And that question of productivism that Saito likes to talk about or not is an important detail that has to be worked out. But for Foster, it just makes obvious sense that, well, of course, at one time, Marx could write about with this really productivist emphasis that everything's about making life better, the material life better for the poorest. We want to increase the living standard of everyone. And so we have to produce more stuff to produce better lives. Okay, that makes sense in context, but it also makes sense that once scientists start pointing out, well, there are problems in the world system, the natural, how the metabolism, that word metabolism, that Saito liked to use. That metabolic system, that's a part of reality that we need to pay attention to. Humans, because we're part of nature, we are part of this metabolic relationship with the natural world and how soils regenerate and how water regenerates and how air regenerates itself over time. All of those systems are part of the same nature that we're part of. And so of course, Marxism wants to understand them and respond to them in ways that are going to be beneficial to human beings, which is the whole point of what Marxism is after, is right, trying to improve life for everyone. So Foster then what he's really arguing then is there is no tension. And he was making this argument before people were really aware of the details of the notebooks that Saito is talking about. So for Foster, it's just a logical point that if you're going to be a Marxist, of course you're going to be an environmentalist. It would be insane not to, because that's the world we live in, and Marxism is about the whole of reality, not just human history. It's not just historical materialism. It's the dialectical materialism that includes everything in the universe. So to introduce that idea, then I found this curious lecture by a professor who he's got to be in Lahore in Pakistan, based on the references he's making. And he's doing a little philosophy of history that's leading up to where Engels comes into this question, because Engels did much more, wrote more, and talked more about the systematic philosophy than Marx did. So, but because they collaborated about sort of everything as they went along, the general assumption is that whatever Engels was writing is just what Engels was very interested in, but Marx is not disagreeing with it, or he would have made those disagreements known. And the same with Engels. When Marx is writing something without Engels, Engels knows about it. And this is just something Marx is especially interested in. And if Engels had any big disagreements, he would have made them known, because they're collaborating through their whole lives. But Engels anyway gets sort of the credit for being the one who's more interested in this systematic philosophy, and he did that in two books, and they occupy volume 25 of Marx and Engels' collected works, and they're called Anti-Dühring and the Dialectics of Nature. See if I can find a better. Anyway, not that important, but Anti-Dühring and Dialectics of Nature. So this book, Anti-Dühring, is a critique of a philosopher named Dühring, who was a social democrat, and so he's not revolutionary. He's wanting to advocate, gradual transformations to get to socialism, that reformist program of the Social Democrats. So Engels wrote this book criticizing him, which laid out a lot of the foundations of this systematic view. But in order to sort of bring all of that into a conversation with the natural sciences, he wrote the second book, Dialectics of Nature, in which he explains how the laws of dialectics work in the natural world and why it's important to understand them. So anyway, the professor in Pakistan is doing some intellectual history where he's talking about how Western intellectuals in particular ended up sort of moving to this point where what Engels is saying suddenly makes sense as the sciences are overturning more religious views about how the world works. The whole video was a little over half an hour, I think. And the first half of it is kind of deep history, where he's talking about the Greeks and the Middle Ages and the role of the church in the Middle Ages. And the important point in there is that the Catholic Church especially was teaching the world that reality is an expression of God's will, and God's will must be perfect. So whatever God wants to be in the world is what is, and it's there because it's supposed to be there. So if you have kings, that's because God wants there to be kings. And so nothing actually really changes because the plan is always being followed because it's God's will. So yes, there are days and there are nights and there are months and there are years, and so there's these cycles of time, but everything keeps going back to sort of the same thing, right? Summer will again be summer after the other seasons. Individuals live and die, but they get replaced. And so nothing really changes. And in particular, what matters in conversations for natural science would be the idea that species don't change. That whatever exists on the planet is what exists, is what always has existed, and is what always will exist. Which also includes where the continents exist. So plate tectonics is a big disruptor to this theory too. The idea is everything's the way it's supposed to be, and it doesn't really change. That idea starts getting challenged in the sort of late Middle Ages, especially getting into the 1600s. And so the part of the video, I think I picked up, if I have it queued up right, is the part where he's going to talk about how intellectual history gets from sort of like Galileo making challenges to the idea of how the planets are organized, to Engels writing a book like The Dialectics of Nature. But he's not actually going to tell us a lot about the dialectics of nature, just this history of how we got to it. But I thought it was a really interesting little bit, so I wanted to show it to you. Okay, share, that's what I need. That would be here. Oh, whoops. Let me look at my note. Where did I want to start? 2308. Come on.
It's going to be divided into two different parts. The first is a
It does have a
Today,
couple
I'm going to
commercials.
teach you the pink salt trick, or even better,
This lecture is going to be divided into two different parts. The first is a broad overview of what Engels is
Sorry
talking
about that. I
about
thought I had
when he
this.
talks about the dialectics of
All right.
stars and planets. But there was a problem. High as the natural science of the first half of the 18th century stood, above the Greek antiquity in knowledge, and even in the sifting of its material. So they knew more. But there was a problem. It stood just as deeply below Greek antiquity in the theoretical mastery of this material. Their theory had not caught up with all their empirical work. In the general outlook.
One point I guess I want to mention that's significant because he's going to come back to it is that with the Greeks. So that philosophy in the Middle Ages, which he also points out was common in Islam as well, is actually rooted in Aristotle. And it's because Aristotle, curiously enough, was lost to history for like 800 years or something. So Aristotle comes along as a student of Plato, and he starts his own school, and he teaches a lot of students, has some important students. In fact, Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle's at one point when he was young. And the school that he starts, which is called the Lyceum, existed for a few generations after Aristotle's life. But somehow his work just sort of lost popularity, and people keeping track of scrolls that had his books on it also got sort of lost track of. And so there's these hundreds of years where the only philosophy from the Greeks that's making any impact in the Western world is Plato. And then around 1100, some Islamic scholars, and there are two stories about it, but they both involve different Islamic scholars in different spots, uncovering these scrolls where they unroll them and have to track down somebody who can read the ancient Greek. And it's like, oh, hey, who's this person we've never heard of? This guy Aristotle. And so Aristotle, his books start getting copied and start getting spread around, and both leading Islamic scholars and leading Catholic scholars, in particular Al-Ghazali on the Muslim side and Thomas Aquinas on the Catholic side, pick up Aristotle's philosophy and decide they're really going to run with it. And Aristotle he's sort of the root of the idea that it's all the way it's supposed to be. Aristotle's philosophy was very, we call it teleological, right? We've talked about this word before. So he had this idea, everything's being drawn towards an end goal that's predetermined, where it's supposed to be. And so that becomes an easy argument for the Catholic Church to make. Oh, okay, that's because it's God's will that's the source of the teleology of nature, and that's why we are where we are, is because this is where we're supposed to be. But as it happens, there are some important we call pre-Socratic philosophers, so philosophers who lived before the time of Socrates. And most importantly, for our purposes here, was a man named Heraclitus, who was famous for arguing that reality is like a stream. It's always in constant motion. So this idea of flux is the word he used. And there's a student of his came up with the pithy little phrase: "You can't step into the same river twice." Because the river has changed, it's moved, all the water's changed. It's not exactly the same river anymore. And another 100 years later or so, another student came up with the even pithier little phrase: "You can't even do it once." Because while you're stepping in the water's moving. So it's not even the same river while you're stepping into it. It's because it's changing constantly. So everything is flux. Now, that's going to be an important idea when Hegel comes along to talk about dialectics and change. Everything is moving. So we get Hegel going back to this important idea from Heraclitus that everything is flux. Now, interestingly, in the East, right, this is already, well, the idea gets picked up actually around the same time because the major Taoist thinkers are contemporaries with Heraclitus, but they're saying the same thing. Reality is flux. That's one of the basic observations of Taoism. So, but the Chinese in that intellectual history don't seem to have a figure comparable to Aristotle to latch onto the idea that things are permanent. And so philosophy, especially in China, has always had this very strong emphasis on flux. So that's to Chinese philosophy is just like what we've always known. Of course, reality is flux. They didn't have to go through any kind of challenge to that. But for the West, there was a really big challenge against the authority and the worldview of the Catholic Church that no, in fact, everything is changing. So this is actually what Engels is getting at here, is that when he said the reference to Greek antiquity it's a reference to Heraclitus, that so the Europeans, up through the first half of the 18th century there had collected a lot of interesting scientific knowledge, the first collection of scientists doing chemistry and physics and biology. But they didn't have the access to Heraclitus that they really needed to fully understand what it is they were discovering. And so that's where Engels can come along and use Heraclitus as well as, but specifically Hegel's terminology, but the idea of flux in his book Dialectics of Nature.
Richard,
Yeah.
wouldn't just observation of the world around us come to the conclusion of flux?
Well, I mean, it can. It certainly can. I think it sort of depends on what you want to see.
Oh,
So,
what you want to see.
That if you want to see permanence, you point at a mountain.
Oh.
And in human existence, absent a volcano going off, the mountain doesn't change.
Oh, yeah. And I'm thinking of trees and flowers and people dying.
So they're obviously noticing the cycles of nature and those little changes in time, but they're seeing them as little cycles that just keep repeating. And so it's not going anywhere.
Oh, okay.
1 year becomes another year, becomes another year. So you have cycles of time, but not cycles of change.
Oh, okay. That's a good distinction.
So it's, but if you are paying more attention, then you do start noticing the little things that do change, like the patterns of where the animal's arm does shift slightly over time, and where the forest is might shift slightly over time. So, but it would take a while, because in most people's experience, they're referencing, they're looking at the mountain and going, yep, it's still there.
But we are in flux too, right?
Exactly. Everything is flux.
It's not necessarily the good flux.
Well, yeah. Yeah, just because it's changed doesn't mean it's good. Change it.
The general outlook on nature still was the medieval outlook on nature, despite the fact that they had discovered all these new things about nature. What was that? Science was still deeply enmeshed in theology. Science had to escape from that metaphysical theological view about the immutability of nature. For Greek philosophers, the world was essentially emerged from chaos. But for the scientists of that period, nature was ossified, something immutable, and for most of them, something that had to be created at one stroke. Everything in nature just came like that, by God, etc. Everything came instantaneous. Nothing new was created. No new species came into being. No new plants came into being. No new continents could come into being. No new elements could be created. No, it just had to come into being in one instant. That's how they viewed it. Everywhere it sought and found its ultimate resort in an impulse from outside that was not to be explained from nature itself. In every instance, they would find, okay, how did the solar system come into being? It was created by God. End of story, etc. There was no examination of how gaseous clouds could have come together and revolved and so on, its own evolution, etc. So this was a major issue. Science still held on to the idea of the absolute immutability of nature. For example, planets and their satellites, once set in motion by the mysterious first impulse, circled on and on in their predestinate.
And first impulse is that's Aristotle. He uses the word prime mover, I think is the prime mover on one end of history, one end of kind of reality, and then an unmoved mover he talks about on the other end of reality. But anyway, fact is, it's the Catholic Church easily takes up the way Aristotle talks about that kind of thing. Even for Aristotle, it wasn't a personal God that's the source of all of this, but because he's talking in a way that's very theological, it's easy for the Catholic Church to just, oh, okay, this makes sense. We'll just adopt that.
Destined ellipses for all eternity. Okay? The planets, the stars, they're just going to go around and around like that for all eternity. They're neither created nor will they die. Stars remain fixed and immovable in their place, keeping one another therein by universal gravitation. Stars are also fixed. The earth had persisted without alteration from all eternity. The continents, etc., the way they are, they've always been like that, and so on. The way the earth is always been like that, and so on. The way the 5 continents had always existed, and they had always had the same mountains, the same valleys, the same rivers, the same climate, and the same flora and fauna, except insofar as change or cultivation had taken place at the hand of man. Okay, so nature was immutable. The species of plants and animals had also been established once and for all and could not change.
And it's something I've sort of been noticing recently when I'm watching something about archaeology, is that more recently, we're aware of the fact that climate changes, but there's a lot of archaeology where it seems like they're sort of oblivious to that idea, and they're trying to figure out how the world looked based on what they find in the ground, but they seem to assume that the climate they're standing in was the same climate that the people who left whatever they found, 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, it's the same climate they had. And so whatever they're finding, you're trying to figure out, well, how does that relate to the climate I'm in? But in fact, the climate they were in might have been radically different than the one you're in. So like a lot of biblical archaeology, the Palestine in the time of the biblical text, 2,000 years ago, had a different climate. It was a little bit cooler and a little bit wetter, and so more hospitable than the climate that you experience now. So you go to some place like where the Essenes were. Where I can't remember the name of that place. Anyway, there's this spot out in the desert where this group called the Essenes hung out, and it was a weird little cult for men only for a while that thought that the monarchy in Jerusalem had become corrupt, which I think was common opinion. But anyway, they were going to do something about it by running away. But when you look at the site today, it just seems like, oh, how in the world could anyone live here? What were they doing to live here? But the point of the question needs to be, how was the world a little different that they did live here? Anyway, so it's still hard for us to think about change kind of in a comprehensive way, because everything is always changing. And even when we're running around doing archaeological research, got to remember the world was different in the time when the thing was made compared to when the time the thing was found. But it's hard on the old human brain to keep track of all that.
Now, logical consistency of thought is the only thing that could overcome this defective knowledge. And this is where philosophy plays a key role for science. Philosophers play the key role in the further development of science, because philosophers were also reading the scientists, and they are the first ones to say, if all of what you're saying is true about the natural world, then our philosophical view about the natural world, especially with respect to its immutability, has to change. He writes, it is to the highest credit of the philosophy of the time that it did not let itself be led astray by the restricted state of contemporary natural knowledge, and that from Spinoza right to the great French materialists, it insisted on explaining the world from the world itself and left the justification in detail to the natural science of the future. So they didn't have all the evidence back when Spinoza was writing. But from little bits of evidence, they came to the conclusion that this idea of the absolute immutability of the universe was wrong, and that things were in motion and in change. Perhaps the first great shot in this regard was fired by Immanuel Kant, who wrote this book, The General Nature of History and Theory of the Heavens. What did he say in this? He says the first impulse is totally wrong, this idea that there was a first impulse and then the world was created like this, etc. In fact, the whole solar system was explained as something that had come into being. The solar system has its own history and evolution. It doesn't just come into being in one instant by God's command. It evolves in time, says Immanuel Kant. If the earth was something that had come into being, then its present geological, geographic...
Here it's worth mentioning, Immanuel Kant, in his own lifetime, was more famous for what he wrote about what we call anthropology today than he was his philosophy. But because the anthropology was primitive and it becomes outdated really easy, but his philosophy stuck around, so people still talk about his philosophy. But in his life, he was actually more famous for this natural science kind of stuff.
And climatic state, and its plants and animals likewise, must be something that had come into being. It must have had a history, not only of coexistence in space, but also of succession in time. Laplace and Herschel expounded Kant's philosophy in science. So he gave this idea initially that all of this has evolved. It did not come into being in one instant. It has a history of creation. But he didn't know scientifically how to prove that. Other scientists came later, much later, and began to prove it and prove it and prove it. But philosophically, he had come to that conclusion. The first big break was made by geology. This is not made by people who were against religion or anything of that sort. In fact, they were themselves priests and so on. Geology points out not only the terrestrial strata formed one after another and deposited one upon another, but also the shells and skeletons of extinct animals and the trunks, leaves, and fruits of no longer existing plants contained in these strata were discovered. This was a big shock, that they were animals that they found in the layers of the earth that no longer existed. They were extinct animals. And they thought to themselves that they had believed for such a long time that nature was immutable. All the species that had existed had been created by God and would live forever. But now suddenly they discovered that there are a whole bunch of these species that don't live anymore. We don't find them anymore in nature. And secondly, they began to think about how these layers of the earth, and they began to date them and try to understand them. Now, at that time, the church thought that the world was maybe 6,000, 4,000, 6,000, 6,500 years old. But Lyell was the first one to say that the earth must be much, much older than that. Much, much older than that. How did he come to that conclusion? He began to really look at these things, and he began to say, okay, look, what's happening is that the earth's layers, the whole soil of the earth, in a certain sense, is in slow movement. It's almost like we are living upon this volcano, the crust of which is constantly always cooling off. We're sitting on the cool part of this volcano, but it's constantly in motion. And that's how you get all these volcanic eruptions, and you get new things coming up from under the earth. They come to the fore, and the old things from the earth go down. You get layers and layers of that. And you can actually begin to not only date these layers, you can also begin to date the plants and the fossils of the plants and animals that you find there. And you can create a chart of them. And this was done all before Darwin's time, okay? So Cuvier said in place of a single divine creation, He had the idea of a whole series of repeated acts of creation. He said, God doesn't just create once, tuck, all the animals are created and plants are created. No, maybe God creates and then he creates again and then he creates again. Why? Because we're seeing new things coming out in the fossil record that don't exist over here but exist over here. And we see things that are dying out, that exist over there but don't exist over here. And what's going on? So clearly life is changing. We're seeing that. So maybe God is recreating these things. And Lyell first brought sense into geology by substituting for the sudden revolutions due to the mood of the creator, the gradual effects of a slow transformation of the earth. So the earth itself is changing and transforming. Then the next big change came in the 19th century, and this came in physics. And the change was that now people began to demonstrate, firstly, Mayer and Joule, that heat can be converted into mechanical energy, and mechanical energy can be converted into heat. All of this we study in 5th grade. Back in the 19th century, this was not 5th grade physics. This was cutting edge physics. Groove proved that physical energy, mechanical energy, heat, light, electricity, magnetism, chemical energy can all be transformed into each other without any loss of energy. Hence, he proved Descartes' principle that the quantity of motion present in the world is constant. Descartes had already come to this conclusion. He couldn't prove it scientifically. Matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. You read this again in 5th level physics, but here it is. Physical energies could be transformed into each other under definite laws. This proved that the idea of the immutability of physical energies was also wrong. So Pele immutability, of the stars and planets, etc., that's being challenged, and now about energies is also being challenged. Then in chemistry, similar changes began to happen. Lavoisier and Dalton created organic substances from inorganic compounds. And now it's, you can create proteins, etc., in a lab. It's not hard, in a beaker. And bridge the gulf between inorganic and organic nature. Hence, the immutability of organic and inorganic substances also was challenged. You can turn one into the other. Okay? Not hard to do at all. And now in biology, the same change began to happen. New research began to show that separate species of plants and animals become more and more inextricably intermingled. Okay, you can see that they are intermingled, etc. You began to see commonalities between them. Animals turned up, such as Amphoxus and Lepidosiren. I can't say the words correctly.
Okay, I had to look these up just to see what the heck is he talking about. So the first one, it turns out, is this sort of creature. And so apparently there's something about its biology that doesn't fit with other animals that it should be related to. And so it was disruptive. And then the other one he mentioned is this, a kind of eel. So anyway, but to biologists, these are important examples, but I don't know enough to know why they were so important. But okay, that's what's going on.
Etc. That made a mockery of all previous classifications. New kind of animals are being discovered. Organisms were encountered which was not possible to say whether they belong to the plant or the animal kingdom. You don't know whether it's a plant or an animal. What do you say about it? It's kind of in between both of these things. So then C.F. Wolf in 1759 began to say that there has to be, he began to challenge the idea of the immutability and fixity of species. An idea held in medieval times, thanks to Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, etc. But now being challenged, no, these things are not fixed. In fact, they always transform, they change. Then comes Oken and Lamarck and Baer, and finally Darwin in 1959, who talks about the origin of species. He's not talking about the origin of life. He's not even talking about the origin of man. Man, apes turning into man, etc. He's just attacking one particular very important thesis. And that thesis is the immutability of species. He's saying they are mutable, they change, they mutate, and they're doing it constantly. Nature was now seen as being in a cycle, in a flux, in constant change. So science, in that sense, returned to Greek philosophy. He says we have returned once again to the ancient Greek philosophy, but there's a difference. The Greeks didn't have all this knowledge about how energies can be transformed into other energies. The Greeks didn't have this knowledge about how species were not immutable. The Greeks didn't have this knowledge about the stars and the planets and their orbits and so on and so forth. They didn't have this knowledge or understanding about the fact that the earth itself has layers upon layers that are coming out of the sea all the time, or the oceans all the time. We have all that knowledge, and we've returned to the idea of the Greeks that everything is in flux, everything is changing. There's no immutable thing in this world, in nature. Everything in nature is constantly, given time, constantly changing.
Doctor, should I eat eggs or oatmeal for breakfast?
Neither.
Too many eggs, dangerous or just overhyped?
And so we come to the idea of the evolution of life. We come to the idea of the evolution of matter. And we also come to the idea of the evolution of history of humanity itself, how humanity has itself gone through change. Animals, he says, have a history, but history is done to animals. They are not conscious of what they do. Human beings, insofar as they move away from animals, they become conscious of how they can change their own history. We make our own history, in other words. If we apply this measure to human history, we find that there still exists a colossal disproportion between the proposed aims and the results arrived at. The proposed aims are, we want to create a society of liberty, equality, fraternity. But when we create that society, something else happens, right? The proposed aim, we're going to create Pakistan and everybody's going to be equal because we're all going to be Muslims. But then we create Pakistan and we discover Muslims are killing Muslims. Why does this happen all the time to us in politics, in history, in economics? Why does it feel like human history, although we are determining it, but it feels like human history is not really being determined by humans? It feels like it's being determined by some other force, because whatever we want to do with it doesn't end up happening. Something else ends up happening, etc. Why is this the case? He says, take an example. In advanced industrial countries, we have multiplied production so that a child now produces more than 100 adults could in the past.
Now remember, all of these quotes are from the Dialectics of Nature. This is all Engels that he's quoting.
What is the result? Increased overwork, increasing misery of the masses. Every 10 years, a great collapse. Darwin did not know what a bitter satire he wrote when he talked about, the competition of the species and survival of the fittest. We see that every day in the stock market. Only conscious organization of social production, he says, in which production and distribution are carried on in a planned way, can lift mankind above the rest of the animal world as regards the social aspect, in the same way that production in general has done this for men in the aspect as a species. We have gone above the animal level in terms of production. We can produce what animals cannot produce. But in terms of social production, no. In terms of the social effects of our production, no. There's no plan there. That's chaotic. That's capitalism for you. So historical evolution makes such an organization daily more indispensable, and it will come about, and that is what he wants. So in sum, all that comes into being deserves to perish. Everything that exists will come to an end. And from this, just logically, he comes to the conclusion. He says millions of years may elapse.
This kind of stuff just blows my mind, that Engels was had this idea that long ago, that to think about what's the future of the cosmos going to be. And that it's just amazing to me.
Hundreds of thousands of generations be born and die. But inexorably, the time will come when the declining warmth of the sun will no longer suffice to melt the ice thrusting itself forward from the poles. When the human race crowding more and more about the equator will finally no longer find even there enough heat for life. When gradually even the last trace of organic life will vanish, and the earth, an extinct, frozen globe, like the moon, will circle in deepest darkness in an ever narrower orbit about the equally extinct sun, and at last fall into it. He says, I don't have the scientific proof to show that this is going to happen, but logic, dialectical logic, is saying this is also inevitable. Everything that has life also has a death. The earth has a life, it will also have a death. And in this way, but he leaves a note of optimism. One second. He leaves a note of optimism. He says, the eternally repeated succession of worlds in infinite time is only the logical complement to the coexistence of innumerable worlds in infinite space. So just as the earth is destroyed today in the eternal cycle, tomorrow another earth, another kind of life will inevitably come about. And I conclude with this paragraph, beautiful paragraph. He says, it is an eternal cycle in which matter moves. a cycle that certainly only completes its orbit in periods of time for which our terrestrial year is no adequate measure, a cycle in which the time of highest development, the time of organic life, and still more that of the life of beings conscious of nature and of themselves, is just as narrowly restricted as the space in which life and self-consciousness come into operation. A cycle in which every finite mode of existence of matter, whether it be the sun or nebula, vapor, or single animals or genus of animals, chemical combinations or dissociations, is equally transient, and wherein nothing is eternal, but eternally changing, eternally moving matter, and the laws according to which it moves and changes. But however...
That was one sentence.
Yeah.
That is amazing. He had that insight.
That long ago. Yeah. Apparently the longest sentence ever written is in French, and it's like 3
Yeah.
pages long in a printed book. But some languages handle longer sentences better than English, so they wrote in longer sentences. But it's interesting to see, even the translator did a good job. He kept it as one
Yes,
sentence.
he
This
did.
one too, one sentence.
However often and however relentlessly the cycle is completed in time and space, however many millions of suns and earths may arise and pass away, however long it may last before the conditions for organic life develop, however innumerable the organic beings that have arisen, that have to arise and to pass away before animals with a brain capable of thought are developed from their midst, and for a short span of time find conditions suitable for life, only to be exterminated later without mercy, we have the certainty that matter remains eternally the same in all its transformation, that none of its attributes can ever be lost, and therefore also that with the same iron necessity that it will exterminate on earth its highest creation, the thinking mind, it must somewhere else and at another time again produce it. So life will come about again in the future, even if it is destroyed, which it inevitably will be on this earth.
Watch what healthy food is.
Yeah, yeah.
I love his passion.
That's Mhm.
His passion when reading it was so amazing.
It was like a big poem.
Yeah, right. Which you think about it, it's a translation. So it's somebody translating who actually was able to keep the language flowing in
the rhythm,
a beautiful way. Yeah, interesting.
When you said the words actions of one species, I imagined Attenborough saying, and here's a human walking into Walmart. If he could document all our activities.
To do that. Yeah. To do it. Oh, yeah, that would be good. Attenborough style documentary on the human species. All right. Oh, gee, time's going by so quickly. Okay. Let's see. I'll skip to this. I had the cute little thing about dialectics, but I'll skip that. We'll go right to Foster. It's him, a little bit of him introducing one of his books, and then I think there's a panel discussion, but I'm only interested in the little bit that was just him talking. So, and then next week we'll go back and do some stuff, some new stuff I found with Saito. Let's see, that's there, but I need this. Oh, I need this. Okay, here we go.
Especially honored that this focuses on my book, The Dialectics of Ecology.
And see, I mean, you can see his interest in Engels just in there, and that he chose that title. That using the word dialectics that way is this obvious reference to dialectics of nature.
Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, in their Dialectical Biologist, referred to our world as the alienated world.
Okay, Levinton and Lewontin. I actually read one of their books. I was going to hope, and I was yesterday trying to find it and I couldn't find it. But it's really amazing to discover what does a scientist do who takes these kinds of ideas seriously? Because these are biologists who, professional academic biologists teaching in university, but both of them Marxists in a general orientation. And so when they write about biology, they're writing about it from this dialectical standpoint. And the kinds of observations they have are just very different than the kinds of observations you get from a biologist who doesn't have that kind of philosophical sophistication. And he's just referencing one of their conclusions, but all just the examples they use are just really interesting because it's not what we get trained to think of when we think of biology, but they're thinking about biology in terms of constant change. So it's a whole different kind of emphasis.
And of course, that came mainly from Marx. And what they meant was that our world is alienated because we have alienated labor. That is, labor is alienated in our society, and alienated nature. We've alienated nature from human society. And this produces an alienated consciousness and what we might call alienated bourgeois or liberal consciousness, in which the frameworks for thought are primarily determined by idealism, dualism, reductionism, etc., that forms of thought that fragment or invert the fundamental relations of the material world and human relations to the material world.
So they're curiously, kind of broadly speaking, there are two broad ways that you can intellectually approach the examination of something in the world, whatever, anything actually. And one is to try to isolate it as much as possible to see what it is doing, whatever it is, whatever you're trying to study. But the dialectical approach is to try to see it in all of its relationships. Mm-hmm. And so you get in dialectics this emphasis on totality, which I think he's going to come back to in this talk. I screened a couple of them to find the best one, and now I've lost track in my head some of the details of which is in which, but this was definitely the best one I found. But anyway, but dialectics is going to emphasize that the world is a totality of interactions, and so if you want to understand a thing, you have to understand it in its interactions as opposed to understanding it in its isolation.
And this is a very serious problem because we live in the alienated world. So alienated that we now have a planetary ecological crisis. We're essentially destroying the conditions of human existence on the planet. And this is not an opinion. This is the global.
But also notice the we are destroying. Moore would have immediately raising his hand saying, "Who's this we?"
Scientific consensus. And the planetary ecological crisis, of which climate change is only one part, raises for us the question of the Earth system in science terms, but it raises more fundamentally the problem of totality, the problem of how do we see the world existence, the human relation to the world as a whole. And in looking at totality, we need to turn to Marx and to some extent Hegel, but Marx provides probably the most unified analysis of totality in all its aspects that we have as a basis for understanding and method. And if we think of Hegel famously said, the truth is the whole. And that's often quoted, but if you read the other part of the passage or the remainder of the sentence, he says essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, then it can only be understood in terms of its becoming. Uh-huh. And this, in order to understand totality, we have to understand it, how it's mediated. And we can only understand that in historical terms and in material terms. So we have to
And so, yeah, in philosophy, the word people usually use would be being instead of becoming, right? And which is the technical study of that is called ontology, which is part of metaphysics. So when you think about that intellectual history, right, there's hundreds and hundreds of years of European thinkers thinking about things in terms of being, because being is constant. Because the world is a constant. They're created once, it's always the same. It's so what's at issue is what is being. And so when Hegel comes along and says, no, it's about becoming. I mean, number one, he's capturing that insight from Heraclitus so long ago. But number two, it's really a radical challenge to the whole way of thinking that no, your whole thought process is flawed because it's focused on being. It needs to be focused on becoming. That the change has to be an integral part of all of the thinking process, or you're not actually understanding whatever it is you're trying to understand.
Understand it genetically, but Hegel and Marx both referred to genetic exposition, that is, looking for the origins of things and their development, their becoming, their historical manifestations as the key to understanding the world as a whole. Now, within Marxism itself, we have a problem of fragmentation. And this is a problem of fragmentation that resembles many of the problems within liberal or bourgeois thought itself. So we have a situation in which materialism has been removed from dialectics. Materialism has often been removed from Marxism, at least materialism in the ontological sense, having to do with material reality, the nature of being, as opposed to just economics. And dialectics has been...
So that's his reference to the historical materialism versus dialectical materialism point that I was making earlier.
Moved from Marxism in the sense that the dialectics of nature has been excluded, so that the whole notion which both Marx and Engels presented of a dialectics that applied to the entire natural world, which is totality, of course, material totality. Human society is an emergent form within the totality of nature, and yet the dialectics of nature was abandoned by Western Marxism, and in a different way by Soviet Marxism, beginning with Stalin. So many aspects of Marxian dialectics got excluded, including the ability to deal with the material world in its entirety. That whole realm of the dialectics of nature, most famously associated with Engels, was excluded from Marxism within the entire Western Marxist philosophical tradition in particular. And the result was that Marxism had very little to say about science or Western Marxist philosophy. There was still a Marxist tradition within science, but that often got ignored. So you have a situation where Marxism became distanced from science and also distant from materialism in the full sense. Materialism became simply economic relations or means of production, and the whole idea of human beings as corporeal beings, as material beings, as part of material existence, which we now think of as ecological, got excluded from Marxism. So Marxism got fragmented in this way. It got fragmented in other related ways. Engels got excluded from Marx. Engels was removed from Marx. Engels came to be associated with Marxism, and Marx was a pure thinker who had no relation to Marxism. So, so the interpretation has gone, and
so it's the postmodern kind of fad that was in academic thought for a number of decades, from like the 60s through especially probably through the 90s. I think it starts fading away in the 90s. But that postmodern thought is suspicious of philosophical systems. So the idea that Marxism would be a philosophical system comes under attack, just as that in that system building itself becomes suspicious and seems sort of because it's interested in the totality, it can have a way of becoming totalizing, in that it wants to kind of run everything, or you get this totalitarian feel, which of course referencing Stalin in the background kind of makes some sense. But philosophically, what it meant was that nobody, or virtually nobody, in philosophy was doing anything related to systematic philosophy, where your goal is to understand all of philosophy under one kind of systematic thought. And that's what dialectical materialism is doing. And so what he's talking about is that divorce that happened, especially in academic circles. So as a way of just sort of avoiding fighting about the philosophical system, a lot of Marxist thinkers just retreated to their specific topic, and then are relying primarily on the historical materialism instead, and theories of class struggle and that kind of stuff, or Marxist economics. So you get a divorce of the parts, the academic disciplines that are interested in Marxist thought, from a system of Marxist thinking itself. And Foster's, his whole point is that's a great loss, because along the way we lost track of the fact of how interconnected humans are to the natural world, and therefore why it's so important to understand the natural world for everyone, including Marxists. That makes sense? Okay. I feel like
so Marx became removed from Marxism, from the entire Marxian tradition, outside of a very narrow spectrum of Western Marxist philosophy. And you have a situation where a Marx is actually taken away from Marxism. Marx now belongs to philosophy independent of Marxism. But this is all part and parcel of the elimination of materialism from Marx, the removal of the dialectics of nature, and actually as well the removal of any kind of revolutionary perspective. So it becomes necessary to reconstruct Marx materialism and materialist dialectics. And for me, although I recognized this for a long time, it didn't become a pressing issue. It didn't become a pressing issue to try to reconstruct Marxism until I started addressing ecology. And then it became clear that Marx's ecology derived from his fundamental materialist conception of nature, underlying the materialist conception of history, and that without an understanding of Marx's materialism, we couldn't understand Marxist ecology, and we couldn't really move forward on the ecological front. In fact, I concluded that Marx's ecology was derivative of his materialism, of his materialist conception of nature. So much so that if you dig into that, if you look at Marx's materialism, you which I followed all the way back to his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus and his relation to Epicurus in a book that I.
So Epicurus, you've heard of him, but important Greek philosopher, who we generally misunderstand. He was actually much more interested in disciplines. When we think about Epicurean as being about food and good food, it's sort of like what Epicurus was teaching was actually the opposite of that. Was you should be choosing a simple life, in order to avoid strife in social relations.
I now have coming out called Breaking the Bonds of Fate, Epicurus and Marx. But this was foreshadowed in the opening chapters of Marx's Ecology. Unless you go back to that fundamental materialism, you can't really understand what ecology was for Marx or how Marx managed to make the great advances in ecological thought that he did. In fact, it's his materialist conception of nature which pervades all of his works, but is what is often ignored. That is the real basis of his ecological perspective. This differs from a lot of thinkers like Koei Saito, focuses on Marx's earliest statements about ecological crisis, or what he thinks were the earliest statements about ecological crisis in Marx, which he says, began in the late 1850s or late 1860s. And it's true that that's when the metabolic rift analysis began to form, but that wasn't the beginning of Marx's ecological analysis. That actually goes back to the very foundations of his thought, and it is crucial in, it's a part of his materialism and crucial to his entire analysis from the beginning. Even in terms of the ecological problem, you see Marx writing about it already in the economic and philosophical manuscripts. So the roots of Marx's
economic and philosophical manuscripts was a collection of material that Marx seemed like he was getting ready to prepare as a book, but never actually published. And they were written in the mid to late 1840s. And only discovered in the 1930s in somebody's attic in East Germany. Literally, somebody went up to the attic, found this box, like, hey, look, here's something Marx wrote we didn't know about. Was very popular in the 60s when it was first published in English.
Ecological perspective is his materialism, but Marx's materialism is different than materialism as we often hear about it, or as often even perceive it. It isn't a mechanistic materialism or a reductionism, but we often we call mechanism now reductionism oftentimes. And so if you look at Levin and Lewontin's dialectical biologists, they're criticizing reductionism, but what they're criticizing is mechanism. And a mechanistic materialism, it's true that it employs some critical aspects and has been fundamental to the development of science. And it is in some ways at odds with idealism, but in some ways it also reinforces an idealist viewpoint. And it leads you into rigidities, into dualisms and reductionisms, notions like the mind is a secretion of the brain, which was a famous mechanistic statement. Marx and Engels would have none of that. Theirs was a materialism that was dialectical in nature.
Okay, so the guy who was doing the lecture made a reference to those early French materialists in Engels' language, and so there were a number of figures in the late 1700s and early 1800s in France who were figuring out, a philosophy of a material world. But what they were doing was putting it into a kind of clockwork. So, which is what he's intending by the word mechanistic, that there's just sort of one thing bumps into another thing and bumps into that thing, and so the clock moves like the clock moves. But a dialectic, welcome back. But the dialectical approach is not mechanistic because it's seeing these things in interactions. So it's not sort of one thing causes another thing. It's that there's this relationship between these things we call cause and effect that's important to notice, not just the fact of one thing causing another. So the materialism that Marx is using in large measure was developed, these decades earlier by those thinkers whose names we've forgotten. But what Marx was doing was marrying that materialism with Hegel's dialectics in order to get dialectical materialism. And so that's the point Foster's getting at. Anyway, it's really interesting listening to him because a lot of well, I guess for so long, philosophers have been not interested in systems. And so it's interesting to encounter someone whose whole argument is, well, you're not understanding the environmental problem because you're not understanding philosophical systems. You need a systematic approach. That's the thing Marx was actually giving us. If we noticed it and paid attention to it, we would be doing this environmental stuff all along, but we weren't paying enough attention to the importance of the system and the fact of humans as material beings in a material system. Okay, we're about out of time, so I think that's probably enough of that. I'm going to go back to Saito next week to end. Yeah, I think next week's our last class. And so any last minute questions?
Well, I just always wonder about the personal responsibility we have.
Mm-hmm.
And I really can't come up with anything helpful to the world and its climate and how it's evolving than thinking, well, when I die, I want my body to go composting in the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do that now, and then you become a tree.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing is you have no choice in the trees. You can only be a birch. and that suits me fine because the birch tree has a way of pulling off its skin and it looks like paper. You can write on it. And so that's kind of symbolic.
Mm.
But that is really all I can think of what I can do for my grandchildren. To leave this earth just a little better. I don't know what else to do. And we're creating so much wars and we're creating all this difficult, different climate systems. And we're ruining things. I think we're a lost species, to be honest. And I think the world is better off if we're not there. Sad, isn't it?
That's also something
That's what I think.
talked about. It's weird, but politics, the moving of history maybe is a young person's game. As we get older, we're can't do as much, and we don't have the same kind of energy that 20-year-olds have for getting stuff done. So I've noticed that myself getting older. Sort of don't be able to do as much as I used to.
So this notion of isolation versus interactions, we really need both, don't we?
Yeah.
In a way. Yeah. We
So
need to study
so the critique
both.
is more just that is the sole focus on would be that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Better nuance, yeah.
Well, I think of humans as a society and humans as an individual, or ants individually versus ants as a colony. Very different view.
Yeah, yeah. But we're all connected.
Mhm.
And if everybody knew that, I think we'd be all better off.
Yeah, probably. There's that education thing.
But people are becoming more and more isolated. They're not
Yeah,
connected.
yeah. This is the deep irony of the age of the internet is we thought we'd all be more connected, but somehow a lot of there are a lot of younger people who are more disconnected than ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's an old train of thought in some of the indigenous spiritual practices, the concept of all my relations, and that refers to everything, you know, the land, the water, the trees.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, and you know, the stuff we were doing early on was pointing out that even in the Middle Ages, they seem to have a better sense of that material connection, that they're doing things to maintain the soils in little subtle ways, but they were vital. And then you get to capitalist organizations, and all of that goes out the window.
It's amazing
Very,
that
very deep insight.
we disregard those things that are needed for our survival. Actually,
The irony.
really, Jane. Yeah, the
Yeah.
water, the air,
Mhm.
and the dirt.
This, yeah, it turns out, yeah, that dirt is vitally important.
But that's because of capitalism.
Yeah.
You know, we find all kinds of ways to use the earth to make more money for us rather than to sustain it.
It's greed, really, because we could still have capitalism if people constrained themselves.
Mhm.
Well,
we're capable. We're capable of constraint. Or if we saw the world as the indigenous people do and had capitalism, it would look very different.
Well, see, it wouldn't be the point. I guess the point these people would want to make is it would be capitalism.
Oh,
not as we know it.
Yeah, if your primary focus is not on short-term profit, or at least if the primary purpose of the firm is not profit, it's not capitalism anymore.
I ran across a new thing called B corporations. Have you ever heard of that?
Is that the ones that have multiple purposes?
Yeah, I think I didn't go in depth, but they talk about making a profit and being conscientious of their people and the environment.
Yeah, and the argument is that when those kinds of firms have to compete with, I think they are called C, that's B, and the regular one is called a C type.
Okay.
But when those have to compete with the regular corporation whose only purpose is profit, they can find themselves at a disadvantage where they get pushed out. And so that's why the idea is that the system motivates the greed. The greed doesn't motivate the system.
Oh, I see.
You have to be greedy to survive in capitalism.
Oh, that's true. That's really true in healthcare, where nonprofit healthcare companies struggle, and whereas for-profit companies, it is in their charter that their number one goal is to provide return to their investors above any other duty. That's their number one duty.
So anyway, so that's the idea. If we reorganized it, you wouldn't call it, wouldn't be capitalism anymore. It'd have to be something else.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Till next week.
Bye.